He stood with a pocket full of diamonds and a heart full of death, watching a Russian sniper shake hands with the First Lady of the United States. That's the opening line from Kate Quinn's The Diamond Eye. I'm Donna Allward, and welcome to this month's Writing Room.
And I'm Barb Tanner Wallace, and if we're doing opening lines, that must be because we're doing kick butt openings.
That's it.
Welcome to our tips. Chapter is your one opportunity to grab readers' attention, set the tone, establish the characters, and open the window to the world the readers are about to enter. It is probably, it's one of the most important chapters of your book, if not the most important chapter.
Yeah.
So luckily for you, Donna and I have written a dozen of them, 100 of them, opening paragraphs.
We've done a bunch.
Okay, Donna, I'm going to ask you this because your book's coming out in the end of this year, early next year. How many times did you rewrite the opening chapter?
Oh my God. I don't know. I bet you it was... I bet you I rewrote it probably 4 times, but I revised it probably over a dozen.
Yeah, I'd say I probably did a good 5 or 6 or 7 versions of that opening chapter.
Yeah. I mean, there are some versions of it that don't exist at all anymore, and then other versions that are just now in a different spot in the story or have been anyway. Yeah, it's my opening, probably 20 pages, actually were not even in my manuscript that they bought. They were added during revisions.
So there you go.
So we wrote a whole new opening for revisions.
So that should tell you people how important the opening chapter is. If everyone, it is never the first time. But anyways, we are going to create for you our do's and don'ts for creating a kick butt opening.
I like how you sort of PG'd that. Yeah. All right. So number 1, open with a bang and don't start too soon. So a lot of us, when we start a novel, we work our way into the story. We clear our throats, so to speak, with description or extraneous action. But we use it to set up the story. So we might have our heroine waking up and getting ready for work. Or we might have the star pilot studying his ship before taking off on his mission. And in my first ever manuscript, which was in 2001, like a long 22 years ago, oh my goodness, my heroine was sitting and looking out the window at the garden. It was like the most boring opening ever. And this kind of throat clearing is fine in a first draft. And sometimes, you need to know things that the reader doesn't need to know. So you have to write it for you. And, no one hits the ground running on the first time, unless
as they just pointed out.
Yeah, unless this is kind of your writing superpower, right?
Yep.
But then when you're done your first draft and you're ready to revise, make sure your opening paragraphs get to the heart of the matter. And Kim Taylor Blackmore, who wrote After Alice Fell, which was one of our reads from last year. Was it last year or the year before?
Oh, might have been the year before.
But yeah, it was a great book. She once directed a class to delete their first paragraph and reread the opening, which is interesting because sometimes we get really attached to our first lines. But if we look at the examples that I gave earlier, like particularly the star pilot studying his ship, that's really low action. And it's not what I would say is opening the story with a bang. If you show him in the middle of a dogfight with, things blaring in his cockpit and, he's in danger and he's in the middle of something, that's starting in the middle of the action. You don't need to have that set up so much. There's lots of times to filter things in. Yeah.
Do set the tone for the rest of the book. Let the reader know straight away what kind of book they're going to be reading. Is it dark and gritty? Is it funny? Stick with this tone. Do not false advertise. Don't false advertise. There is nothing a reader hates more than reading something that's they're reading a funny opening, like something humorous happens, and then it turns out to be like a sad serious story of reinvention. This is a great time to know what conventions are for the genre you're in, because different genres have different styles and different tones. If you're a cozy mystery, you're probably going to open with a much different style than, say, a rom-com or a post-up. If you've done, I wrote down post-apocalyptic, just to make me say the words post-apocalyptic.
You and Sue have trouble with that one. I'm sorry.
But yes, we do. And but the opening of that book is going to sound a lot different than the opening of a space opera or a romantic rom-com. And if you open whatever, or even a literary book, do not start with like a literary voice and then move into genre fiction. Stay with the same tone throughout the whole time.
Right. Because I mean, readers pick up books because of what they like and what they expect. So, you know, meeting reader expectations is big. So if you do false advertise, then you're going to lose a reader. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah. All right. Well, the same thing is also, don't put an ad, like imply that the plot line is something different as well.
Yeah. All right. So tip number 3, do introduce major characters early, and demonstrate to the reader why they should care about what happens to them. So unless there's a good reason to bring someone else in, like don't spend a chapter on a secondary character or someone who's going to be killed off by the end of the chapter, or perhaps, you know, sometimes I think of it rather than necessarily the opening chapter, sometimes that opening 3 chapters, like sometimes that sort of seems to be like if you were submitting, it would be your proposal length, or whatever, but really those opening chapters. So if you're going to get rid of this person, don't spend a whole lot of time on them. It really should show the main characters plural, goals, motivation, and conflicts. And yeah, I know it's the pesky GMC thing that we talked about last time. But your GMC drives your character, and your character drives the story. So using the diamond die as an example, we're introduced to the main character very early, learn that she's embroiled in a difficult divorce with her husband, who is an arrogant jerk, and she's worried about how his behavior is rubbing off on their son. And you immediately connect with her because she's a mother and she's in a frustrating situation. So very quickly you're introduced to her, and you get on her side because, you know, what her conflict is relatable.
I was gonna say, there's one caveat about don't spend the chapters on secondary, don't spend the whole chapter on a secondary character. I actually say that 99% of the time. The one caveat would be is if you have a character who you are going to kill off in the first chapter, but they're going to be a major character in absentia, you know, so that their journey is going to be there with you as part of it. And it's usually in a mystery.
Yeah.
You know, like the person was killed, and then your other character is spending the rest of the time trying to recreate what was going on with that person.
Right.
So there's still a large presence in the story. But if it's just, you know, the ex-husband who dies, and now we're about her rebuilding, we don't really need to see the ex-husband dying.
No, and I think it's a matter of deciding what information the reader has to have versus getting them to completely emotionally invest in this character, only to have them die later. But yes, in a mystery, sometimes you need to have that just for context, right?
Yes.
Right.
But for the most part, I would say absolutely.
Yeah, and there's an exception to every rule, right? Like some stories work differently, and it, as we've learned from the very beginning, it's all in the execution. So, you know, nothing is written in stone, but I think they're pretty good basic guidelines.
I think so too. I think that if you follow these and learn these, then when you break them, you have specific reasons.
Right. Know the rules before you break them. That's it. All right. Your next one.
Carrying on to the next rule. My computer doesn't want to play. There we go. Don't overload paragraphs with exposition, world building, or backstory. Do choose details that have maximum impact.
Right.
We've said this before. Readers don't want a lot of backstory dump. And it's very tempting to get going with the throat. It goes back to throat clearing. It's very tempting to dump a lot of information because it's important to the story, or so you think. And it probably is, but you have plenty of time. If this is a 200 or 400 page book, there's plenty of time to layer in a lot of information. Choose the stuff that is the most important. Going back to that Kate Quinn again, what's the most important thing? That she's a female Russian sniper.
Yeah.
And that she at some point is shaking hands with the first lady. So all you know is that something's going on, and what?
Yeah.
And I read the other day, was that from the very first point, the reader must want to know what's going to happen next. So
Right.
do not waste a lot of time building, even if the language is beautiful.
Right.
You'll have plenty of time to use that.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to what I said earlier about what you need to know versus what the reader needs to know.
Mm-hmm.
And so you need to know all those things, and the reader might need to know those things too, but they might not need to know them right now in order to understand the situation. So I think as long as you're sort of judicious with what details you choose to put in, and then you sort of unwrap it slowly, then it actually peels back layers and just works so much better in the long run, and it keeps the pace moving, because nothing will kill your pace quicker than a big info dump.
Right. I mean, that's not to say you can't include any, because everyone has a style, and there's nothing wrong with exposition. I know I've read the opening chapters of Donna's, and there's some.
Oh, there 100% is. And sometimes I think, oh, maybe I was a little heavy with that, but I'm not writing 50,000 word romance.
Right. And it's all necessary detail, because it's going to come to play. So I guess the rule is don't overload it with information that is never going to matter again.
Right.
And know what matters at that moment versus what can be played later. And choose the details that are most important and will have maximum impact at this time. Mm-hmm. This is a particularly good rule, remember, for science fiction authors, because a lot of times they feel compelled to have to explain the science behind what they're doing, a lot of new science fiction authors, and you can make the assumption that people are going to buy into the term. If you say he went to Romulus 6, they're going to assume, okay, that's a planet, and they don't need to know, that that's where so-and-so came from. And,
Right. And I think fantasy as well, anything that requires like massive world building for people to understand. And it's hard to know what to do. And that's why we rewrite our beginnings so many times. Yeah.
That's it. So.
All right.
And our last big one.
Do get to the inciting incident early. The inciting incident is that moment that something happens to propel your characters into the story. It's the moment when perhaps your protagonists meet for the first time, when the party goer drops dead. So now we've done the meet cute and the dead body. So we've covered, mystery and romance. But it's really a moment that changes the trajectory of everything for that character and sets them off on their journey, whatever that journey may be. So in the book that I have coming up, the inciting incident is not so it's set in World War I during the Halifax explosion, and I always want to say exciting. I hope it's exciting.
It's a dull explosion. Yeah.
The inciting incident is not actually the explosion. That doesn't happen until it's a fair chunk into the story before that actually happens. It's more the backdrop of the story, but the main heroine's inciting incident is actually a decision that she makes that she can't go back from. Like once it's made, it's done. And so that sets her on the path that her life is now going to take. It can also be more subtle. For example, in The Diamond Eye, the inciting incident is when Mila's husband taunts her on the shooting range. And it makes her lose her temper, and she misses the target. And she gets really angry and says, that'll be the last mistake. And you can see from that, then that everything Mila does from this point is going to take her to that moment of, shaking the First Lady's hand. Like this is the start of her journey as a sniper. Really what makes an opening tricky is actually balancing all these things. And I think that's why we end up rewriting them or revising them all the time. So as I mentioned earlier, the one that I just finished, I said that, the opening that's there now actually just got added in revisions, I almost never add to my opening. It's usually cutting it to move forward and start in the right place. But in this case, I had to go and add 2 scenes to the beginning. And that was to establish what I mentioned earlier, which was the GMC of the character, the goals, the motivations, and the conflicts. And then when she gets to make that decision that's going to change her life, you understand why. It had to be there to provide some context. And so because those,
I've heard of authors will say they wrote the opening and it turned out to be chapter 5.
yeah, I'm usually not that far ahead, but that doesn't surprise me. I mean, let's face it. When I started this book, it was a dual timeline with a whole different storyline, character, and everything, and I ditched the whole timeline and then added a new character. So, you know, my opening changed drastically when I really started going.
Well, and I think that when you say balancing, I think that for a lot of authors, you fall on one side or the other. One is assuming the readers need to know a ton of stuff, or assuming the readers know as much as you do in your head, because you've lived with these characters forever. So it seems like, oh, well, of course they know this. And then you realize, no, they don't. So it's a balance of how much they need to know. Yes. And I think that's, beginning authors or all authors, we all do it. So I'm not even going to say beginning, fall on one side or the other, and then you have to go back, which is why the first chapter gets rewritten so many times.
Well, and I think too, it depends on if you are if you're a plot writer or a character writer.
Yep.
Because trying to balance establishing your character with the inciting incident, so moving the plot forward, taking time to establish your world building while also keeping the story moving. I mean, those are hard things to balance and get right out of the gate. Really, I think more than any other, and I have a client like this too, an editing client that I work with, and we always end up making the bulk of her changes to her openings, like probably her first 50 pages. And I think that's me as well. Like, starting in the wrong place is really common. And so it's probably why it's the part of the book I revised the most. And that actually brings us to a bonus point.
That's it. Which we are going to debate about a little bit.
It is a debate. Well, yeah, you either love them or hate them. Well,
because generally the rule with opening chapters has always been, or at least where I've always found, is you start when the trouble begins.
Yeah.
And, or right close to when the trouble begins. And we should back up just quickly, because I was thinking, when we say begin with a bang or whatnot, don't feel that needs to be a big, huge action thing. Like Donna said, her inciting incident is a very subtle incident. It's a quiet incident in a lot of ways, that she makes a decision. But there's no explosions, there's no chases, there's none of that stuff. It's a very human moment. So don't feel like you have to create this huge dramatic thing, especially if that doesn't fit in your book. Because you're like, well, I need it to be exciting and grab the reader. It's like, you grab the reader because the character's so identifiable. You
grab the reader with tension.
Yes, and that buys into whether they like the character and want to know what happens next to them.
Yeah.
But so prologues. There is nothing more debated, although there are many things debated, but we did a lot of time debating whether or not a prologue should exist. And
okay, so draw the line in the sand, though. Are you a yay or a nay?
I am a big nay. Most of the time. I find that there are very few exceptions where the prologue is necessary. And
I'm also
I've read very, very established authors, and they're, they've written prologues, and it's like, well, I could have lived without it. Not that clearly they know better than me, because they're, huge multi-sellers, but I'm usually an A.
I usually am too.
Mm-hmm.
I usually am too.
Nah, you're a convert now, though, because you wrote one.
I'm not a convert. So I just think if you're going to use it, it really has to work. So I have never, until this particular book, I have never written a prologue out of 65 books. Never have I written a prologue. And I'm usually a big nay, because I usually, a prologue to me is usually a backstory dump where the author wants to show something that happened to the main character in the past. But most of the time, that information can be layered in just as effectively without it being a chunk at the beginning.
I agree.
And all it does when you put it at the beginning is it prolongs the time it takes to get to all the things that the opening should be doing. So what makes that really weird, as being someone who is generally anti-prologue, my editor suggested that I write a short prologue for this book. And I was a bit skeptical, but I thought, it's okay. I'm going to do it. I'm going to indulge her and do it and just see how it turns out. And I think it really helped to set the tone of the story. I thought it brings readers' questions like into their mind. It shows instant stakes and some tension. And so I think what really works best for me, and I'll speak to this as a reader more than a writer, since I don't have a lot of experience writing prologues. The ones that work the best for me are not the ones that have a big backstory dump or an info dump or something happened to the character in the past. The ones that work best for me tend to pull from a turning point that happens later in the book. So like the line from Kate Quinn's, which was about him standing there with a pocket full of diamonds and watching her shake hands. And we know then, as we go back to the beginning of the war and begin her journey toward that moment, that moment's coming. And we're wondering how she's going to get there. And we wonder who he is because we don't know. And so it opens up a lot of questions. It sets the tone and stakes. And so I think that works really well. But I think if an author is using it just as an opportunity to like explain something, that can usually be just layered in through your narrative.
Right. Well, and although it depends, I will say one of the most famous arguments prologue arguments is the book Lord of Scoundrels by Loretta Chase.
Okay.
If you're a romance reader, you know the prologue is the hero at boarding school where he's horribly bullied and horribly mistreated. And then you jump into where he's kind of an asshole in chapter 1. And if you didn't have that prologue where you realized that he was tormented as a child, and so it created this person. So that prologue makes him sympathetic. Otherwise, you're like, why on earth would you fall in love, and why would I root for this guy? So she used it as to show that he's not really as bad as he looked.
Right.
And I think then I think it works. And the other one that worked for me was, I just started flipping through it, but is Elka Joshi has a book out, the Perfumist of Paris. And she has a prologue which just talks about her being with her best, sweetest friend. And then it opens up with them remembering someone who's gone. And I'm going to assume that it's the person that she's mentioning. So it gives them a little bit more context to why this person matters and why it's a big deal.
Right. And yeah, so exceptions to every rule. But as a general rule of thumb, I'm not a fan. But when it works, that tends to be when it works for me.
I think if it gives the book extra depth, it works. I think if it
it adds context to your character,
yes.
right?
If it adds context to your character is the perfect way to put it, which I think is what your prologue is going to do too. Add context a little bit.
I think so. And I think more than the prologue, I think the prologue sets up a lot of questions that we know we're going to be led toward this moment in 1918. But how are we going to get there? What's going to happen?
Which is exactly what Kate Quinn's prologue does.
Right. And
you
then
want to know that.
And then the first chapter that I rewrote and added probably 10 or 12 pages, that was what I added in to give context to Nora's character. Because otherwise, her decision didn't necessarily make sense, or it seemed a little too arbitrary. So to go back and show her I only show her like the day before, but it's just something that gives her more context into her character.
Yep. And I can see it. So the bottom line on prologues is still yay or nay, because I think it depends on the story and depends on the characters. So I wish I could give you I wish I could give people a do or don't with a prologue.
It has to be done well.
Write your book first and then go back and do the prologue, maybe?
Yeah. Or write the prologue and then go back and see if you actually need it. It's kind of like that exercise where you remove your first paragraph and then start from there. See if you can actually remove your prologue, and if it doesn't really change the story,
then you probably don't need it.
You probably don't need it. Or
that was the same. Yeah.
Or it doesn't change the reader's experience.
Yep.
Right, because a lot of it is about the reader's experience. So
do write your prologue, then do see if it serves the story.
Yeah, as Susan Meissner said, it has to serve the story. Yeah,
so there you have it. Those are our tips for a kick-ass opening. I didn't PG it this time. And I hope that
this long, we're good.
I hope that you guys got something useful out of it. We've got a few more things coming up in the writing room in May. It's going to be exciting. Coming up on May 2nd, live, we have Jennifer Robeson, who wrote The Coronation Year, which is perfect timing because May 6th is the coronation. So she's going to come by and talk about her book and about writing about the royal family and how she's gotten, what that path has done for her in her career. And then the book for May's discussion is Only the Beautiful by Susan Meissner.
Yeah, I'm excited.
I am too.
For both of those.
Yeah. There are two books that have gotten a ton of buzz, and I can't wait to break apart Only the Beautiful and see what, why it's getting as much buzz as it is, besides the fact that it's Susan Meissner.
Susan Meissner, I know.
Yeah.
And for Jen's, I will have tea.
Oh.
I mean, I think tea is required for a discussion for coronation year.
Tiaras are optional.
Tiara, I might have a tiara. I don't have a fascinator, but I do have a tiara.
Tiara and coronets are optional.
Well, I mean, I would be a princess, but you clearly would be the queen. And and there may be, I don't know, there may be like scones or something. I just feel like we should have a lot of fun with this one, and Jen's a lot of fun. So
I'm excited. So yes, and it's going to be live, so it'll be even more fun because we can take questions from the audience and you guys can throw up comments and say whatever you want to say. So
you bet.
Oops. So we appreciate you coming. If you enjoyed what you were watching, which apparently is a blank screen.
There we go.
If you liked what you watched, please go to YouTube and like and subscribe, or join our Facebook community, which is facebook.com/group/stepintothestory.
So.
And we will see you next in a week with Jennifer Robeson.
Yeah, we're excited.
Talk to you later. All right. Bye.